The soft hum of indie music filled the air, as the smell of freshly ground coffee mingled with the sweet aroma of pastries in the tiny café on Main Street. Emma pushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear as she wiped down the counter, her fingers brushing against a tray of mismatched mugs. The café wasn't particularly busy that afternoon, but it was the kind of place where time moved a little slower, where people lingered over their cappuccinos, and where she'd spent most of her afternoons for the past 2 years. She glanced at the door just as it swung open, letting in a gust of crisp autumn air. And there he was, Luke. His brown hair was slightly tousled, like he'd just stepped out of the wind, and his forest green sweater clung to his broad shoulders in a way that made Emma's cheeks warm. He'd been hired just last week, but the sight of him walking in still sent a jolt through her chest every time. "Hey, Emma," he said, flashing her a lopsided grin as he adjusted his apron. His voice was warm, casual, but there was a spark in his hazel eyes that made her stomach flutter. "Hey," she replied, trying to sound as cool and collected as possible. "Ready for the chaos of the afternoon rush?" Luke chuckled, slipping behind the counter. "If by chaos you mean Mrs. Donovan ordering her usual pumpkin spice latte and forgetting her loyalty card again, then yeah, I'm ready." Emma couldn't help but laugh. Luke had a way of making everything feel light, easy, like the world wasn't as heavy as it sometimes seemed. The café buzzed with activity as the afternoon wore on. Luke worked the espresso machine, his movements confident but still just shy of perfect. He had a knack for oversteaming the milk, which Emma found oddly endearing. "Here, let me show you," she said, moving beside him as he attempted another latte. Their arms brushed as she reached for the frothing pitcher, and for a brief moment neither of them moved. The contact was brief, but it left a lingering warmth on her skin. "Am I a hopeless case?" Luke asked, his voice soft, his eyes fixed on her. Emma smirked, though her heart raced under his gaze. "Not hopeless, just slightly below average." He laughed, the sound low and rich, and it sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. That evening, after their shift ended, Emma found herself standing outside the café with Luke, the chilly air biting at her cheeks. "You doing anything for dinner?" he asked, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. She hesitated, her breath visible in the cold air. "No plans." "Why?" Luke grinned. "Well, I just realized I'm terrible at making coffee, but I can cook a mean carbonara. You interested?" Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Are you asking me to dinner?" "Only if you want to," he said, his tone playful but tinged with nervousness. No pressure. A smile spread across her face. "I'd love to." His apartment was cozy, filled with warm lighting and the faint scent of vanilla from a candle burning on the coffee table. Emma felt oddly at home as she stood in his small kitchen, watching him pull out ingredients from the fridge. "Okay, so you're in charge of chopping," Luke said, handing her a cutting board and a knife. "Delegating already?" "Bold move," she teased, taking her place beside him. As they worked, their shoulders bumped occasionally, and the easy rhythm of their conversation filled the space. He told her about growing up in a small town, how he'd moved to the city to find something bigger. She told him about her dreams of becoming a writer and how the café gave her the perfect backdrop to observe life for her stories. When she accidentally dropped a handful of parsley onto the floor, he laughed so hard he had to put down his spatula. "Okay, you're officially banned from garnish duty." "Oh, please," she shot back, her hands on her hips. "You nearly set the butter on fire 5 minutes ago." "Fair point," he said, grinning at her. The banter flowed easily, but underneath it was something deeper, an unspoken connection that neither of them dared to name just yet. Dinner was ready, and they sat across from each other at his small dining table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting a warm glow on their faces. Emma twirled a forkful of pasta, smiling as Luke watched her expectantly. "So?" he asked. "Is it edible?" She took a bite, pretending to mull it over. It's okay, I guess." "Just okay?" He feigned offense, leaning back in his chair. Emma laughed, shaking her head. "I'm kidding. It's amazing." His grin returned, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the comfortable silence saying more than words ever could. After dinner, as they cleaned up, Luke reached for a plate at the same time she did. Their hands collided, and Emma froze, her breath catching. He didn't pull away, his hand lingering on hers. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. His eyes searched hers, and before she could overthink it, he leaned in. His lips brushed hers gently, testing, before deepening the kiss. Her hands moved to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his smile soft and genuine. "I've been wanting to do that since the first time I saw you spill coffee on yourself during your shift." Emma laughed, her cheeks flushed. "That was your fault, by the way. You were distracting me." "And I'll keep doing it," he said, his voice warm with promise. From that night on, their lives intertwined in a way that felt effortless. They cooked together often, danced in the kitchen to old records, and laughed until their cheeks hurt. The cafe became more than just a place of work. It became the backdrop of their love story, a constant reminder of how they'd found each other. Years later, as they stood in that same cafe, now the owners together, Emma would look across the counter at Luke, his hands dusted with flour from the pastries he was baking, and feel her heart swell. Love had found them in the most ordinary of places, over steaming mugs of coffee and messy kitchens, and it had built a life that was joyful, beautiful, and entirely their own.